Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of our podcast. Today we have the following story, a conversation that changed my life. Are you ready? Let's go. It was one of those rainy Thursday afternoons in late autumn, the kind where the wind lashes against the window panes and the world outside feels as though it's dissolving in a gray watercolor painting, when I found myself tucked away in the far corner of a small, nearly empty cafe nestled between two old bookstores I had never noticed before, not far from the university campus. I had just left a lecture on existentialist philosophy that left me more perplexed than enlightened, and with my mind still tangled in Camus' absurdism, I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching droplets chase each other down the glass as I tried to sort out the knot in my thoughts, and that's when he walked in, an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with silver hair combed back neatly and a worn leather satchel slung across his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something beyond the visible. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, he chose the seat across from me. Offering a polite nod before settling down, pulling a battered notebook from his bag, and after a few minutes of comfortable silence between us, he glanced up and said, in a voice that carried both warmth and gravity, "You look like someone with questions," and maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe I just needed someone to talk to, but I found myself responding honestly, telling him I felt lost, about my studies, my future, my sense of purpose, and instead of offering generic advice or empty platitudes, he asked me, "What do you want your life to mean when you look back on it from my age?" Which startled me, not because it was a difficult question, but because I had never actually considered it seriously. I stared at him, fumbling for a response, and he simply smiled, sipped his tea, and continued, "You see, people chase so many things, money, recognition, security, but very few ever stop to ask whether those things will matter when their time runs out," and something about the way he said, "when their time runs out," made me shiver slightly, as though he were speaking from the edge of some truth I had only skirted before, and so I asked him what he meant, and he leaned back, tapping his fingers lightly on the table, eyes focused far beyond the cafe's fogged-up windows, and told me the story of how, when he was young, he had pursued a high-powered career in corporate law, driven by ambition and the illusion that success would bring fulfillment, and for years he climbed the ladder, made partner, bought a house, traveled the world, until one day, in the middle of a conference in Singapore, he received a call that his younger brother had died suddenly in a car accident back home, and in that moment, he said, it was as though the scaffolding of his life collapsed in on itself. Everything he had built felt meaningless, and he realized he had missed his brother's last birthday, last Christmas, last phone call, all in the name of progress, and after the funeral, he couldn't bring himself to go back to the same life, so he left it all behind and spent the next few years traveling without purpose, trying to make sense of the silence his brother left behind, until one morning, in a small village in Morocco, an old woman invited him into her home for tea, and during that quiet afternoon, she said to him, "You can only carry so much. The rest, you must put down," and though he didn't understand it then, those words stayed with him, guiding him as he rebuilt his life not around ambition, but around meaning. He became a teacher, mentoring young people, volunteering in community centers, writing stories, always asking himself whether what he did would still feel worthwhile if today were his last day, and I remember sitting there, stunned, the weight of his story settling in my chest like a stone wrapped in velvet, and I asked him whether he regretted anything, and he said, "Only the time I spent asleep while thinking I was awake," which echoed in my mind like a bell long after the words left his mouth. We spoke for nearly 3 hours, about books and loss and resilience and how courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite it, and as the cafe emptied and the rain slowed to a drizzle, he stood up, packed his things, and before leaving, he handed me a small, folded piece of paper and said, "You won't understand this fully now, but keep it, someday it'll make sense," and with that, he disappeared into the misty street like a figure from a dream, and when I opened the paper, it read, "What you seek is not in the answers, but in the living of the questions," a quote I would later discover came from Rilke, and for weeks after, I found myself reflecting on that afternoon, on his words, on the way he listened without trying to fix, the way he offered presence instead of prescriptions. And I began to notice how often I moved through life on autopilot, reacting instead of choosing, chasing instead of understanding, and slowly, I started making changes, not all at once, but deliberately. I switched majors, started volunteering, kept a journal where I wrote not what I did each day, but what I felt and noticed, and over time, I began to feel more grounded, more aligned with something quiet and essential within me. And even now, years later, when life grows noisy or uncertain, I return to that moment in the cafe, to the echo of that conversation, and I remind myself that clarity rarely comes in the form of epiphanies, it arrives in small questions asked with honesty, in the courage to sit with discomfort, and in the conversations that touch something deeper than logic, conversations that ask not, what should I do, but, who am I becoming? And though I never saw him again, I carry his voice with me still, like a lighthouse in the fog, steady and silent, reminding me that the most meaningful shifts often begin not with an answer, but with the willingness to ask the right question. So, we have reached the end of our story today. Thank you very much for being with me until now. See you in the next episode.